Thank you, and bon appetit, everyone. As Daria has said, I'm standing in for Alex Gorsky, who is the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. When I joined Johnson & Johnson more than 30 years ago, I'm not a millennial, I was not thinking about the purpose. I was thinking about having a good job and being able to show my parents that the investment in my education has been worth something. But I landed in the right place because I landed in a company that did have a purpose and used the purpose in their business. A demonstration of that we did have a purpose is that our credo, which is the statement that shows that we need to take care of our 4 constituents, consumers and patients, employees, communities, and shareholders, was issued for the first time in 1943, so 77 years ago. So it runs deep in a company like Johnson & Johnson. And during this period, we have had 57 years of consecutive dividend increases and 36 years of consecutive earning increases. So it shows a good connection between purpose and results, and that's part of what we are going to be discussing here. Alex was one of the signatories, and Johnson & Johnson was one of the signatories of the Business Roundtable Purpose of the Corporation Statement, and the 2 CEOs that I'm going to be inviting now were also signatories of the BRT statement. So I would like to invite Deanna Mulligan. Deanna, please. And David Abney. David? So Deanna is the CEO of Guardian, and David is the CEO of UPS.
That's right.
Okay, I got it right. Thank you. So, Deanna, how long have you been at Guardian as CEO?
I've been the CEO 8 years.
Okay.
I've been there 12.
Okay. And how did you make the transition into the insurance industry?
Well, I've been in the insurance industry almost my entire career. I spent close to 10 years at McKinsey & Company. I was a partner in the financial institutions practice, and I did a lot of insurance work there. But I worked, my first job out of undergrad and before graduate school was actually with an insurance company. So I was, I think, the only person in my business school class who came from insurance and went to insurance. I've always been a little bit of a nerd.
That's great. So you also had a particular passion for UPS, because I read that you started there as a driver at UPS too.
You know, I had to get promoted to become a driver. And when I was a freshman in college, I went to work as a loader. And I did that for 3 years. And then when I graduated, I drove for a year. And I've been the CEO for 5.5 years, but I've been at the company, next week will be 46 years.
Okay. Wow. So let's start with the questions. I'm going to start asking a couple of questions, and then I'm going to ask you to ask them questions to make my moderation job easier. Right. So, Deanna, what reaction had in your company the fact that you were signing the purpose of the corporation statement of BRT? Did you get any reactions?
Well, it was really a natural for us to sign the Business Roundtable Statement. I remember when I saw the first draft and I showed it to some of my colleagues, and they said, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Guardian is almost 160 years old, and we were founded by a German lawyer who was concerned about discrimination against immigrants in the United States at the time, and German immigrants couldn't get life insurance, and he thought that was not right. So we've always had a social purpose, and we still live by some of his statements, believe it or not. We have all of his writings from 160 years ago, and one of his most famous was, a life insurance company should live forever. I mean, you know, talk about a long-term point of view. And his reasoning was, if you're selling insurance today, life insurance to someone, they're hopefully not going to need it until 50, 60, or 70 years from now, maybe even longer today. So as long as you're selling life insurance, you have to have a horizon that's almost infinite. So we've always run the company that way. We are owned by our policyholders. We are not a public company. So our customers are our owners, which has given us a very long-term perspective on our customers. And we have a very long-standing set of values, which are we do the right thing, people count, and we hold ourselves to a high standard, very high standard. And we start, believe it or not, this may be a little familiar from J&J, we start almost every meeting with a slide where we talk about the 3 values and how we're doing fits in. So from that, the Business Roundtable seemed like a really natural extension.
Thank you. What about you, David? Was it, how did it land in UPS, the fact that you were signing the purpose of the corporation statement?
Well, when we first found out about it, again, it was a very quick decision because it's the way that we have managed our company since the founder. And, you know, in most circles, 113 years would make us very established. But here I feel like a startup compared to Guardian at 160. But so inside the company, there was just no concern about it. We didn't debate it. We knew we would be a part of it. What we were surprised about is the number of companies that signed and signed so quickly. And so it really became, at the end, if you didn't sign, you were kind of highlighted, right, as one of those few companies. And there were a couple that cared just as much about these topics as any of us do that did not sign, but didn't sign for other reasons. But what surprised us, I think, more was the reaction we got, not as much from our investors, but from the media. The media portrayed this in some cases as more of an or, you know, so if you're not going to put the shareholder first, then you're putting other stakeholders first. The way we looked at this is that this is an and that all these are interconnected. And if you're going to provide long-term shareholder value, then you better be taking care of your customers. You better be treating your employees the way that you need to, and the suppliers that you work with, and the communities. Healthy communities spur healthy business environments. So we just saw it as all one connection. And so it kind of took us back a little bit when it was headline news for a couple of weeks, you know, throughout the world, just not in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me open it for the audience, and so we give you more time to ask questions. Any question from the audience?
I got your mic.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think what you have described in terms of your reaction is very much the American view or the U.S. view, and the European view of this stakeholder-shareholder debate seems to be a little bit different, which is more of the putting the labor on the board, having more of the divide the pie mentality. Have you seen a difference between the U.S. approach and the European approach at Davos and other places? And if so, how do you reconcile the two?
Okay, I'll start that one. And I was just at Davos at the World Economic Forum, and I want to be careful because when I'm in these different forums, you know, in many cases you don't know who is European and who's American and the different nationalities. But what it did become a little more obvious to me is that maybe in some countries outside the U.S., there was a little bit more of this was an or mentality versus most of us that are talking in the U.S. viewed it as an and it's a means to an end is what I heard earlier today, and I thought that was a good way of describing it. But I would say there's a little bit more progressive approach that was a little bit more sacrificing maybe profits to address these topics. And I don't want to characterize too generally, but there was a little bit there. You could tell there's a little different perspective. I think it's all based on the same end result, but the perspective is slightly different.
Tina?
Well, I think we heard Professor Henderson this morning who said, you know, this is I agree, this is not an either or, and if other countries feel that way, I think that obviously they're entitled to their opinion, they have different circumstances, but I don't see how we get to our end result without bringing along employees and other stakeholders, and I don't see how that's how we maximize shareholder value in the U.S. I don't have a public company, but I've worked for public companies, and I think the principles are the same, right? And I think the research we saw this morning actually bears that out. So everybody starts from a different position, and in the U.S., we have a little bit of the labor versus capital discussion, but we certainly don't have it in my company, right? We haven't had to sign any pledges on minimum wage because we already pay above minimum wage. All of these things are included in what we do, and we have this past year our 4th year of record profits. I think it's definitely an and.
Thank you. More questions? Okay, so I jump in and I ask you a question. You can fill the void. So, the purpose in your company, it's been there for a long time, but the way it translates in the way you manage the company and your business practices, I get changes. So how do you see things change in your company? What type of things are you doing more of, and what type of things are you doing less as a consequence of your purpose?
Well, we think a lot about the future of work and what that means for our employees. And if you think back to our values, people count, we do the right thing, we hold ourselves to very high standards. Over the years, some of the employees had translated people count into, we offer lifetime employment. And what we've said is, we hope to offer lifetime employability. So we want to invest in you as an employee, and we have an array of initiatives and projects, and we offer over $10,000 a year tuition reimbursement, and if your job is eliminated because of technology, and you're on tuition reimbursement, we continue to pay your tuition reimbursement. We have a lot of programs to make sure people are employable, but we've had to translate lifetime employment into, you may be doing a totally different job 5 years from now. We need to get you ready for that, and you need to feel comfortable with that.
Thank you. And what about UPS? Being in the industry you are in, how is the purpose influencing your business practices too?
Yeah, I would say that, and I divide it in 2 ways. By signing the BRT statement, I wouldn't say that affected anything that we were doing internally, because we were doing it already. But I do believe that it's very important that as you're following this approach, that you realize that culture is something that's constantly changing in your company. You can affect which way it's changing, but when you've been with a company as long as I have, and some of the people in this room, you do realize that's the case. And in our part, we see this as just another way to continue to focus on our transformation of our company. And when you talk about the purpose, and you talk about the different stakeholders, and then you show how interconnected they are, we will constantly be applying more and more innovation and more technology to our company. And if you do that, and you're running more efficient, and you're not growing the company, then we know that that's going to lead to less jobs, right? So we talk about the importance of technology as an enabler, and talk about how important it is that we use this technology to grow our business and to expand. And as long as we grow the business, and as long as we show value to our customers, then yes, we believe there will be jobs for our people, and they may change, and we will help them with the transition, but they play a very important role in our future, and we make sure they know that.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if somebody now has a question. Hi, thank you.
Sorry. You indicated that so much of this work that was stakeholder-oriented is happening already, and yet the public felt this was a big moment, and there was so much media attention to it. How do you think the public will know that there's been a shift in the thinking of companies in general? That, are you saying we were already there, no change is necessary? Or are there some other things that people could look for that would make them think business is taking a longer term view? And I know I'm asking you a general question about business, not your own specific companies, but I'm wondering if you have any insights about that.
I thought it was interesting this morning when we took a poll of CEOs, and it said the poll was, what is the most important thing you can do to indicate that your company is going in the right direction? And treating your customers well only received like a 7% response. Treating your employees well got a huge response, and I believe in that. But I was one of the people who was voting for treat your customers well. So I think as consumers, the general public needs to see this in the products and services they receive from us. Otherwise, it's not working. Right?
Yeah, Nancy, you got my attention real quickly because you uttered a phrase that's really taboo at UPS right now, and that is saying no change is needed. So what I didn't want to imply at all is that because we had this path and this plan and we were going in that direction, that we didn't need to change. In fact, it's just the opposite. The hurdle is being raised by all stakeholders, that we had plans to be able to jump higher, and we had plans in place, but we can just see that the hurdle is going to continue to be raised. So status quo is status no. It's just not the way that you can compete in today's world. So for all of these stakeholders, you can go from being an example of success, and people think that UPS has got a good reputation, is what we're doing from a sustainability standpoint. In fact, the Just Capital rankings just came out, and from a regard of communities, we were number 3 of all companies in the U.S. that were included. And of course, UPSers are thinking, well, how could we not be 1 or 2, right? Well, we were number 3, so that's good. My point is, you can be number 3 today, and 5 years from now, if you don't change, you can be an underperformer, and people start talking about what are you doing. So I think all companies are going to be at different progression levels, but all companies are going to have to continue to make changes, or they're going to fall below the expectations of all of their stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think my previous statement, it should have been, treat customers better, because I think many of the companies in the room, and David's a great example, are already treating their customers really well. So, then the thought naturally goes to, is there more we can do for employees? But I think David kind of proves my point, and UPS treats its customers really well, and it comes out on the top of the scale.
Please.
Excuse me.
She's coming to you. Right here. Just a tight fit.
Labyrinth.
Thank you. Todd Fine from Green Diamond. I'm thinking about the remark about culture. So if you have lots and lots of people with whom you need to affect change, I'm wondering the extent to which you're starting to rely on defining goals and plans that tie to people's performance and compensation to be how you affect that change, compared to maybe other ways that you help educate and inspire the culture to change. How much do you have to bake it in to people's performance and career plans and goals and compensation versus other techniques to get that culture to change?
I think it'd be in both ways. You do look at the financial side. As a public company, the further you go up in the company, the more your compensation is variable based on performance, and I think that'd be that way in most all public companies. And so the elements, that's not me, I promise, the elements that we choose are not going to all be financially oriented. There's going to be others, but be customer-based, employee-based, and obviously financially based. So that is one way to drive behavior. The other, though, is to clearly define what's important to you and how you measure that. And do you just talk it, or are you actually living by and reinforcing? And that's where the trying to affect culture and making sure people understand what you're trying to do. And I'll give you a good example of our transformation. We've had this saying that goes all the way back to our founder, who was the CEO for 55 years. So he's a legend at UPS, Jim Casey, about continuous constructive dissatisfaction. And it was just never be satisfied, always try to make this process better, always do it better. Now we are, as part of this transformation, we're talking about continuous transformation versus constructive dissatisfaction. And the reason we're doing that is constructive dissatisfaction can be good. It can also cause you to keep trying to improve something that should no longer be done. And where continuous transformation is about, okay, let's constantly evaluate what needs to be done, and then let's improve that, and let's not worry about the things that are no longer relevant. So that's just one example of the cultural change that we're focused on.
Back to your compensation question, I think it's necessary because compensation drivers send a message, but it's not sufficient, right? People work for their own motivations and reasons besides just compensation. Yes, they want to be paid and they need to be paid, but you're not going to drive your company to long-term greatness based solely on compensation. To our previous discussion and to David's discussion, you really need a purpose. You really need a corporate purpose that motivates people, particularly in a transforming environment where we're asking people to go above and beyond and to take risks. And they all know they're operating in a world that's rapidly changing. There's a lot of uncertainty. So compensation is a piece of that, but really it's a lot more about capturing the hearts and minds of people.
Yeah, we, for example, compensate people based not only on what they achieve, but also on how they achieved it. So it has an equal weight in our evaluation, and as a consequence, through the how, you can always try to make sure that the cultural values and the principles that the company has are reflected in the behaviors that people have and the decisions they make. So that is as important as it is what. Okay, there's a question there. Great.
Thank you. Thank you. Terrific panel. Appreciate. Have a question about an ESG question, and it's really about the relative weights that we attach to each E and S and G. And the question is, if you think about, let's take S, like none of us would do business with a company that was maiming its employees, right? So that would be the S side. And on the G side, we probably wouldn't want to be doing business with firms that are laundering money for oligarchs. But if a firm is, emitting huge amounts of carbon in the atmosphere, acidifying the ocean, contributing to the disappearance of species and habitats, we're generally much more forgiving of that part of the ESG equation. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, do you see that being recalibrating over time? And if so, what role should leaders of companies like yourselves play in helping us get there with that on the cultural side? Thank you very much.
I'm not sure that I would say we're forgiving of the environmental side. I think there's lots of discussion going on right now about the E as well as the S and the G. And obviously there's more that can be done, but we have this problem of transition, right? Many of us arrived here by transportation that runs on carbon emitting fuels, and we need to get from here to there. So I don't know if it's that we're much more forgiving about the E, but I think it's a little less clear to people how to measure the E and how to measure our companies making the right progress from here to there. I don't know.
Yeah, when I was thinking about your question, the first thing came to mind is you start looking at the E and the S and the G and which is more important, or how do you weight them. Kind of reminds me of your golf game, right? is the drive more important, or is the pitch more important, or is the putt more important? Well, it probably depends on the last hole, right? Whatever you did that you maybe remember the most. I think because of global warming and because of the importance around the world that environmental issues are getting, I don't think that's any longer the case. And maybe it used to be more about talk versus what you're doing, but I think now it's just the opposite. And I'll give an example of that. It's obviously UPS. We have 600 planes. We have 125,000 trucks. And so if we don't embrace the effect on the environment, you know, who should? And there's a lot of industries that are in that same, but we're not waiting on government regulations or anything like that. We know it's the right thing to do. And so we're being as aggressive as we can. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. If we just invested in a company, a minority investment, but investment in a company, Arrival, that builds EVs, so electric vehicles. And we just signed a 10,000 unit contract with them. And that 10,000 vehicles is going to more than double our alternative fuel vehicles in one contract. We also just signed the largest renewable natural gas contract in the U.S. And as this continues to get implemented, we will be the largest users of renewable natural gas in the U.S. from not only a transportation standpoint, but compared to other companies. And those are the things that we're looking at. But what excites us even more is where we can use technology and to help us run the best mile or the greenest mile that is possible. And that's the one that doesn't exist. Because of using Orion, which is our optimized dispatch technology, we're actually able to eliminate millions of miles that we would be running. And when you do that, that makes a much bigger difference than it can in some of these other alternative fuels. So it's a combination of a strategy. Everybody wants to get to net neutral carbon, and they want to get there as soon as they can. But in order to do that, you got to have tangible goals and actions that you're doing right now. If you're doing that, and then you feel like you can get there, and you hear a lot about net neutral, carbon neutral by 2050 or whatever, which is 30 years away. And that can be a very honorable goal if you're doing things right now to get there and to make a difference. It's not as honorable if someone just says, be net neutral or carbon neutral by 2050, and they're not doing anything in the meantime. They just know that someday they will. And I think most people that say that are really focused on the here and now and how to get there. But I really believe it's getting a lot of attention. We can always argue, should it have gotten more? I can tell you that the environmental issues are getting more attention than I've ever seen, justifiably so, right? We have to continue.
Yeah. I also think, to your question, that the ESG reads differently depending on the company too. For example, a company like Johnson & Johnson, society is going to expect us to lead in certain areas which are different from the ones that UPS is leading. So, you know, I mean, for us, we can lead in environmental sustainability, but that's not the number one expectation that society has about us as well. We should lead in ESG. Society expects that we lead now in helping governments and healthcare systems to manage the pandemic of coronavirus, and that's an expectation. So I think that depending on the type of industry and your social mission that you have, then there's a different expectation on how you translate ESG. I have a question here from the online, and I'm going to ask it to you guys. It says, corporate CEOs pay attention to their largest shareholders' priorities, for example, Larry Fink's memo. How do you integrate what matters to retail shareholders too?
Right. Well, I think you really have to look at the shareholders, the overall perspective, and each of them are very important. And to us, I would throw a third category in there, and that is that we have 150,000 UPS employees, either active or retired, that are shareholders too. So we treat them also as if they were institutional investor. And but I think really when you're looking at something like long-term shareholder value, you've got to have targets, you've got to have goals, and you have to have a path to get there. That does not mean that just gives you an excuse or get out of jail free card on a quarterly basis or on a year basis. Now you need to identify the year and you need to talk to your shareholders about what you expect to do. And you also need to talk about the longer term picture. And I think if you do that, if you're transparent and you give all of your shareholders a good view of what you plan to do, I think it covers you from that regard.
Thank you. Any perspectives,
No,
Deanna?
thanks.
Okay. Another question. Paul. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Are your policy owners or your shareholders asking any different kinds of questions on calls with the company since this whole process of momentum has been accelerating?
Okay, I'll start. And I can't talk about policyholders, but I got the shareholders part of this covered. I would tell you that that the intensity of the discussions about ESG and the frequency of questions is more overall. Now, there were some investors that, over the last few years, this has been important. They probably haven't changed at all. But I would say that that to your typical investor, the ones that I meet with, which would be some of the larger ones, it is more of a topic of discussion than it's ever been before. And it used to be, tell me about what your goals are in these areas. Now it's, tell me how you're going to get there, sort of like what you just said. And so that's where I think it's changed.
Do you get more questions from your employees?
We definitely get more questions from our employees, and I think probably many people in this room have experienced if you're going to recruit on a college campus, you better have an ESG point of view, a statement, a report, because employees care a lot.
Yeah. Amy, you were going to ask a question? The last one.
Hi, Amy Springstill from BNY Mellon. I wonder, how do you resource purpose? I'm wondering about resource allocation, and ESG has touch points across the entire enterprise. Do you have a team doing it? Do you have a council? Do you have champions in each area of the business? I'm just curious about resource allocation.
Right. There's nothing more dangerous than the last question of the day. That is a very good question. And traditionally, you could just barely miss the cut, right? Because if you've got your strategic imperatives that you're focused on, then there can be things like environmental, social, whatever, that you could miss the cut on because you haven't put the overall financial situation in and looked at the other situations too. So I think it's two things. One is you have to be guided by your core principles, your core values. And if this is important to you, if you think this is necessary to reach the long-term shareholder value, then you've got to question, are your metrics and the traditional way that you measure the business, are they accurately capturing that? And if the answer is no, and you can tell by the things that come up above the priority list. If you say this is important to you, but none of those items rise above the cut line, then you realize they're not. Then you have to go back, reevaluate, and take a look at what you're doing. So we do have people that help us capture the entire view, and it doesn't mean that you don't do these things with a financial return too. Like I said, it's all an and they're all interconnected. But you do have to make sure you're capturing the entire picture. And if you think that you're going to get long-term shareholder value and you're going to ignore one of these groups of stakeholders, it's going to all come back on you. And so it may seem okay from your quarterly review when you're planning. It's not going to be okay when one of those groups starts to rise and you realize you're losing customers or you're losing talent or whatever.
Yeah, I agree with David, and I would say our values are how we run the company, and the questions come up in all kinds of meetings. They're not just, pigeonholed into one kind of metric or one kind of group or one sort of employee council. They really are alive every day in all kinds of ways, and I think that's the only way you can make this work.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Deanna. And thank you to all of you for the questions. I hope you have a great meeting. Thank you.